Ебал. Ай! Сука. Да.
Лира, поможи ему.
Затягивай быстрее.
Давай. Давай.
Давай. Тяни.
Стой, перекрой.
Тяни хорошо.
Russian troops are simultaneously storming several fortresses of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Donbas and in the northeast of the Kharkiv region. In mid-November, they suddenly broke into the eastern part of Kupyanks and the center of CHASIV, at the end into the center of Kurakhove and the outskirts of VELIKA, Novoselka. In the latter case, the assault groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation covered about 10 kilometers in the open plains from Ugledar and Shakhtarsk. Although, comparatively, they had passed that same distance south of VELIKA Novoselka in a year with heavy battles. It seems that in the southern part of Donbas, Ukrainian forces focused on the defense of Kurakhove, and VELIKA Novoselka was poorly covered from the east. In general, the armed forces of Ukraine still lack the strength to stop the Russian offensive in several directions at once. If it is possible to slow down the advance of the Russian armed forces in one area, there is also a breakthrough in a neighboring one. The Western think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, reported that Russian troops were demonstrating the fastest pace of advancements since the beginning of 2023, particularly in the areas of Ugledar and VELIKA Novoselka. They described the front line in Donetsk Oblast as becoming increasingly fluid, with Russia capturing several settlements along the CO5-1104 highway to the northwest of Ugledar, including Katerinivka, Yelisavetka, Ilinka, and Romanivka. In fact, since the 1st of September of 2024, Russian forces have captured at least 1,103 square kilometers of territory, compared to only 387 square kilometers in all of 2023. They believe that the capture of Ugledar has allowed Russia to strengthen its offensive operations in the western part of the Donetsk region, and view that Russia may consider the following courses of action next. 1. An offensive on Andriivka, the capture of which would allow Russia to create conditions for the encirclement of Kurakhove and other Ukrainian strongholds. Or 2. The encirclement of VELIKA Novoselka, which is where we will start today's video. But there is more, and this may be the biggest news of this week. We also have to talk about the Kupyanks front, where the Russians have managed to cross the Oskil River and establish a bridgehead there. So hit the like button, subscribe, and leave some support with a super thanks donation. And let's get into it. The Russian armed forces launched an offensive west of VELIKA Novoselka in mid-November. The territories and ruins of settlements liberated by the armed forces of Ukraine during the summer offensive of 2023 were recaptured, that is, Levadny, Rivnopil, and Novodarivka. At the same time, south of VELIKA Novoselka, in the valley of the wet Yali River, the fighting subsided, although it had not stopped since the summer of 2023. At the end of November, it turned out that the offensive west of VELIKA Novoselka was supposed to distract the armed forces of Ukraine from the place of the main breakthrough to the east of the district center. The Russian armed forces, which captured Ugledar in October and advanced from it in the direction of Kurakhove, without waiting for the latter to fall, created a combat group to attack VELIKA Novoselka from the east. Two groups, one along the Ugledar-VELIKA Novoselka road and the other from the previously captured Shakhtarsk road, immediately overcame an open space of 10 kilometers deep and went straight to the outskirts of VELIKA Novoselka. As at last week, on the 20th of November, the Russian forces were clearly shaping a new front around VELIKA Novoselka, striking both head-on and from the flanks. They entered and attempted to secure positions on Makarivka's outskirts, but subsequently lost it back to the Ukrainians. On the right flank, the Russian troops completed the second capture of Rivnopil and pushed north of the village toward the VELIKA Novoselka-Uliapol highway. In nearby Novodarivka, fighting raged in the city all that week. On the left flank, the Russians gained several hundred meters northwest of Novodonetsky. The most serious threat to VELIKA Novoselka, however, had come from the Russian advance toward Rozdony, which was north of VELIKA Novoselka's fortified zone. A breakthrough there would allow the Russians to outflank Ukrainian defenders. It was understood by most of the Ukrainian command that the defensive lines may not be prepared for an attack from this direction. And just this morning, the latest reports suggest that the battle for the city has begun, as the Russian army has entered the eastern outskirts of the village, having traveled 6 kilometers in a mere 3 days. In the coming weeks, Russian troops will attack this important district fortress center from 3 sides, from the west, east, and south, as they did in Selidovi, and as they are now doing as part of the offensive on Kurakhove. The entire southern Donbas front depends on the capture of VELIKA Novoselka. And speaking of Kurakhove, the group of Russian troops advancing on Kurakhove from the north could not reach the western end of the Kurakhove reservoir and cut off the armed forces of Ukraine from the supply lines. But parts of this group on boats were able to cross the reservoir in the center of Kurakhove. At the same time, units advancing on the city from the east approached the center. In recent days, fighting has been going on Pobedy Street in the very center of Kurakhove. Ivan Stupak, a Ukrainian military expert and former SBU officer, believes that the Ukrainian Defense Forces will soon be forced to retreat from Kurakhove. In his assessment on Ukrainian TV, he said, "When we look at the front, Kurakhove stands out. The clock is already ticking. Not weeks, maybe days, until the city will have to be abandoned, unfortunately. The situation is extremely critical. Russian forces have advanced very close to Kurakhove, and now it's almost 70% surrounded." He noted that only one road remains linking Kurakhove to Pokrovsk. However, he warned that in subsections, Russian troops are just a mere 5 to 6 kilometers away. He only hoped that the withdrawal would be more orderly this time, unlike what occurred in Ugledar, where there was no formal retreat order and the troops had to gather their equipment and evacuate under constant Russian shelling, acting on their own initiative. At the same time, from the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove, the Russian armed forces managed to break through to the village of Dani. From the south, another Russian group approached the outskirts of Ospenivka. All this created a threat of encirclement for a large group of Ukrainian troops in the valley of the Suky Yali River. These troops gradually withdraw through Ospenivka to the west. If the Russian armed forces occupy Ospenivka, this will allow the Russian army to reach Kurakhove also from the south.
Бегом! Фланг забирай, вперед!
The Russian armed forces have long since forced the Severs Donets Donbas Canal, which separates Bakhmut from the center of CHASIV in several places. The armed forces of Ukraine were forced to leave all their bridgeheads on the east bank. However, until recently, Russian troops could not advance deep into the Ukrainian defense from these bridgeheads. The positions of the armed forces of Ukraine interfered on the heights in the center of CHASIV itself, towering over all the surroundings. In November, Russian troops were able to break through to the center of CHASIV from one of the bridgeheads near the canal. Now the fighting is going on at the main height south of the refractory combine. At the same time, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to try to bypass CHASIV from the south and the north. In case of success, they will go to the city of Konstantinovka. This will lead to the collapse of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in Donetsk, and in the future will create conditions for the Russian offensive on Kramatorsk and Kupyanks.
Ты обучался. Sorry. How many months you learn
in British Army?
in British Army?
I learn for 1 year. and I stay for 4 years.
Why you come in Russia?
Russia, commander, take my shit and tell me to come. My take passport, everything, my telephone, and say, Machina, давай. I don't want to be here.
The armed forces of Ukraine left their last stronghold in the northwest of the Kursk bridgehead, the Olginskaya Grove. Several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who tried to break through to the Kurakhove district center in the summer and to the northeast to the Rilsk-Kursk road went to this forest north of the Sudza-Kurakhove road. In a few weeks of fighting, Russian troops managed to almost surround the grove, which forced the armed forces of Ukraine to evacuate remnants of this group to Malaya Loknya. Russian troops have not managed to break through to Malaya Loknya itself. Attacks have not yet led to success from either the west, from Novoselka, or from the north, through Pogrebki. But perhaps the main news for this past week is the Russian crossing of the Oskil River north of Kupyanks city. According to the Ukrainian think tank Deep State, the Russian military was able to cross the Oskil River in the Kharkiv region on November 24th and seize the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine on the opposite bank. If the Russians create a bridgehead there, it may threaten the defense of Kupyanks, which is located 20 kilometers to the south. Deep State analysts call this maneuver of the Russian army a rather unexpected operation. According to them, the Russians crossed the river on boats from the occupied village of Dveruchnaya. They landed south of the village of Novoselka on the opposite bank. This is not just overcoming a water obstacle for the sake of a photo, because the enemy took the positions of one of our brigades, the Deep State report says. In this area, the Oskil River is not very wide, about 40 meters, and makes a bend towards the left bank, occupied by Russia. The shore is quite wooded, but the right one, which is held by the armed forces of Ukraine, has a rather atypical relief, namely the ridges of the mountains that begin in the area of Novoselka and stretch up to the border with Russia. South of Novoselka is the town of Dveruchnaya. And this is not to be confused with the village of Dveruchnaya, which is currently occupied by Russia. Once it was a district center, and now the city is almost deserted due to constant Russian shelling. However, Dveruchnaya remains an important transport hub as the roads to Kupyanks, Volzanka, Pavolzanka, and Veliki Burlak converge there. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine did not report on the forcing of the river by the Russian enemy, but in its daily report it directly confirmed this. The summary says that on November 24th, the Russians attacked the positions of the Ukrainians in the Kupyanks direction and in particular near Novoselka. Previously, this settlement was not mentioned in the reports of the General Staff. In a conversation with the Ukrainian BBC service, the head of the unit, which is in this direction, spoke about the attempts of the Russians to create a bridgehead and to force the river. According to him, the Ukrainian military are trying to find and destroy them. The Ukrainian BBC service appealed for comment to the Operational Strategic Group of Troops, Kortista, which is also responsible for this section. Kortista said that they have not yet commented on the situation. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not yet reported on the successful forcing of the Oskil River or the beginning of the offensive toward Novoselka and Dveruchnaya. Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups are constantly trying to land on the right bank of the Oskil and are looking for weaknesses in the Ukrainian defense. Yuri Fedorenko, commander of the Achilles Battalion of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which holds positions near Kupyanks, said in an interview with the BBC Ukrainian service. According to him, the Oskil River is quite long and in some parts of its coast there are dense forests or settlements directly near the water. This encourages Russians to try to secretly cross a water obstacle by boat, swimming, or other improvised means. As of today, these attempts are often detected by the defense forces of Ukraine, and where they try to cross on boats, a fire defeat is inflicted and sabotage groups are caught. There is constant systematic work to prevent the enemy from occupying the bridgehead on the right bank, the combatant said. He points out that it is quite difficult for the Russian military to force the Oskil and other sections of the front south of Kupyanks, for example, near Kurakhove, since it is necessary to build pontoon crossings there. Such structures are almost instantly destroyed by artillery fire or drone strikes. Fedorenko recalls that in the fall of 2022, Ukrainian forces managed to force the Oskil and build a pontoon crossing, not least because the front was not yet saturated with FPV drones and other types of drones. Now it would be extremely difficult to carry out such an operation. That is why, in his opinion, Russians are trying to act according to a different scenario. According to the combat, Russian troops have not yet managed to create a stable bridgehead at Dveruchnaya, and the armed forces of Ukraine are already taking measures to eliminate the enemy. As of the evening of November 25th, the Deep State online map shows that the Russian army is still on the right bank of the Oskil between Dveruchnaya and Novoselka. It holds a section about 650 meters long and up to 200 meters deep. During the Russian-Ukrainian War, it became obvious that forcing water barriers was one of the heaviest military operations. It is extremely risky and difficult to perform, especially in conditions of almost round-the-clock dominance of enemy reconnaissance and strike drones in the air. Problems with overcoming water obstacles have affected the operations of the Ukrainian army. In the fall of 2023, soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine on boats were able to force the Dnieper in the Kherson region and created several bridgeheads on the left bank occupied by the Russians, in particular near the village of Krinky. But the impossibility of pontoon crossings, transfer armored vehicles, other problems with logistics, as well as heavy losses among personnel, forced Ukrainians to leave all the bridgeheads on the left bank of the Kherson region by the summer of 2023. According to the Ukrainian publication Slacked Info, during the operation in Krinky, the armed forces of Ukraine lost about 1,000 fighters. Of these, 262 people were considered dead, 788 are listed as missing.
Даем питание. Даю питание. Взлет. Цель подтверждена, парни, уходим, собираемся.